So you look at everyone around Trump who's being considered for the State Department and the Pentagon and the National Security Council, 100% of them are anti-China hawks.
Hello, 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。Last week, former President Donald Trump received massive support from the American people, crushing opponent Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election. It's clear that for many ordinary Americans, domestic issues like inflation and immigration were top of mind. But today, I'll talk specifically about the China-US relationship and how that may or may not change following Trump's astonishing win last week, with special guest political economist Ben Norton. Now, I'm going to specifically ask him about Trump's announcement yesterday that he will not be welcoming neocon warmongers Nikki Haley and Mike Pompeo into his new cabinet, and whether or not that is actually a good sign for Sino-US relations. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. On November 5, former President Donald Trump smashed Democrat hopeful Kamala Harris in the 2024 US presidential election, securing 312 electoral college votes and taking over both the House and Senate. Domestic issues like illegal immigration and debilitating inflation were important for many ordinary Americans, but that is beyond the scope of this show, which will focus solely on Sino-US relations and how they might change after Donald Trump becomes the 47th president of the United States of America next January. Yesterday, Trump said on Truth Social that he will not be reappointing two senior figures from his last presidency, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, both of whom are widely regarded as anti-China warmongers. Mike Pompeo famously admitted that as director of the CIA, we lied, we cheated, we stole. Nikki Haley, who shamelessly took blood money to push for death and destruction in Palestine and Taiwan, even signing "Finish Them" on bombs that probably went on to kill and maim women and children in Gaza. But is Trump's exclusion of Haley and Pompeo good news for relations between China and the US, the two largest economies in the world? Well, to find out more, I'm joined by Ben Norton, host of the Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, welcome back to the show. First up, despite some Western media's claims to the contrary, China didn't actually have a favorite, per se, candidate for the presidency, seeing as both sides of Washington's two-party system seem quite anti-China. But I was wondering if you think, especially with certain crumbs of hope like J.D. Vance sometimes suggesting Washington should work with China, and with the addition of people like Elon Musk, who obviously has some pretty major insight and connections with China, that there might just be even a tiny glimmer of hope in the distance in terms of Sino-US relations under Trump's second presidency.
Well, unfortunately, I hate to burst the bubble, but there's no hope. And it's not just Trump. You know, of course, the Democrats are also very anti-China. This is really one of the few issues, along with Israel, that Democrats and Republicans wholeheartedly agree on. They strongly support Israel and they despise China. And it's not just about their personal views of China. China is the perfect scapegoat for them because obviously China's rising economically. It's the world's manufacturing superpower. The U.S. is declining economically. It's facing a lot of internal economic problems and it has deindustrialized. So China is the kind of perfect scapegoat that they can beat up on and blame China for everything, even though most of these problems in the U.S. were caused domestically by the decisions of U.S. policymakers and business leaders. Now, in terms of this election, we saw that, Trump came back in on a very anti-China messaging campaign. And of course, Biden and Harris had also continued many of Trump's anti-China policies. Trump started a trade war against China in his first term. And then when Biden came in, some people thought that there was hope that maybe Biden would not take such a hard line. And what actually happened is that Biden continued many of Trump's policies. He continued the trade war policy. He did not end any of the sanctions and tariffs. In fact, he added new tariffs. And the Biden-Harris administration focused on targeted tariffs at specific Chinese industries, especially electric vehicles and solar panels and batteries, which, by the way, are known in China as the three new industries that have been promoted. And now what we've seen is that Trump is pledging to take that even further. During his campaign, he claimed he's going to put blanket 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. I personally think he'll probably backtrack on part of that. I do expect a lot more tariffs on China, but I don't think, unless he's even crazier than I thought, I don't think he'll put blanket tariffs on Chinese exports because Think about how many things China exports to the US that it would be difficult for the US to replace, like household appliances, basic consumer goods, clothing. I mean, the US, I think, is more concerned about technology, semiconductors, electric vehicles, those kinds of industries. I don't think they're that concerned about buying shoes and t-shirts from China. Maybe Trump is, but now looking at the people around Trump, it is of course good news that Pompeo won't be coming back. Pompeo is one of the most extreme anti-China hawks, and Pompeo also has been supporting separatist extremists in Taiwan. So it's good that he's not coming back. Nikki Haley as well. It's good that she's not coming back. Now, as for why Trump didn't choose them to come back, I think it's not really political. I think it's actually more personal. Nikki Haley ran against Trump for president during the Republican primary and was constantly attacking Trump. And Pompeo is also known for having a lot of issues with Trump. And they're both seen as very disloyal. And we know that Trump wants people around him he considers to be loyal. As for people like Elon Musk and other people who have experience with China, I mean, you mentioned J.D. Vance. Now, J.D. Vance actually has been quite anti-China, and part of his whole rhetoric is that China bears responsibility for the U.S. deindustrializing and losing manufacturing jobs. Elon Musk, I mean, he has a lot of business interests in China, the Shanghai Tesla factory, so he could potentially be someone who doesn't push for full-on war with China, who calls for a little more caution. However, we should not forget that in January of 2024, Elon Musk called for tariffs on Chinese EVs. He complained that they were too good. And he said that if there were no tariffs on Chinese EVs, then basically Tesla and other companies would go bankrupt because they cannot compete with very good Chinese EV companies. So, he's not an extreme, mouth foaming anti-China hawk, but I think Elon Musk definitely still has, I wouldn't necessarily call him a friend of China, but he's not going to be someone who's just constantly pushing for war on China, which of course is better compared to someone like Pompeo, who is pushing for war on China.
Yeah, I was going to say with Elon Musk, at least he has a bit of, he obviously has quite a bit of insight into China and connections here. Do you think that maybe even him giving people more of a realistic idea of what China's like, kind of separate from the take over the world kind of China threat that we see in Western media, that could even balance it out even slightly?
Well, it also depends on whom Trump picks for his Secretary of State. So Elon Musk is going to be in the cabinet. Trump announced he's going to create a new cabinet position, which is the Secretary of Cost Cutting. But of course, that's not really a foreign policy position. Elon Musk has been very close to Trump. Not only did he campaign with Trump and fund Trump's campaign, but there are reports that Elon Musk actually sat in on a phone call with Zelensky, the Ukrainian leader. So it does show that maybe Musk will have a role in foreign policy. But if you look at the candidates Trump is considering to be his Secretary of State, that is the equivalent of foreign minister for the U.S. government, all of them are anti-China hawks. Some people who are supportive of Trump are saying that there are, some people who are not neocons, like Rick Grenell. Rick Grenell is a MAGA Republican who's considered to be a top competitor for the position of Secretary of State. It's true that, he's been critical of the war in Ukraine, but he's also extremely anti-China. And Grenell is currently what is he doing in Washington? What is his job? He's leading an anti-China group, an anti-China lobby group. You look at the other candidates who are being considered, like Robert O'Brien, an extreme anti-China hawk. Robert O'Brien was the last national security advisor under Trump. And people say, well, look, he's not John Bolton. John Bolton is the hardcore neocon. It's true he's not John Bolton, but he's still an anti-China hawk. Robert O'Brien said that he wants the U.S. to cut off all economic relations with China, which would be insane. And he said he wants to deploy the entire U.S. Marine Corps to Asia to prepare for war with China. And he said he wants live nuclear weapons testing that would be a form of threatening China. So he's another top contender for either Secretary of State or National Security Advisor under Trump. Marco Rubio, an extreme neocon, is being considered as a potential candidate for Secretary of State. Some people are saying it could be Vivek Ramaswamy, who's this kind of, populist Republican who ran in the primary. However, Vivek Ramaswamy's entire narrative, if you listen to his foreign policy strategy, his entire narrative is that we should be friends with we should be friends with Russia to isolate China. Vivek Ramaswamy is extremely anti-China. So if you look at all of the people around Trump, Mike Waltz is another candidate being considered for either Defense Secretary or Secretary of State, another extreme anti-China hawk. So you look at everyone around Trump who's being considered for the State Department and the Pentagon and the National Security Council, 100% of them are anti-China hawks. So yeah, you might have someone like Elon Musk in there who at the very least will say, we shouldn't have a war. That would be crazy. I and many other billionaires have a lot of business interests and investments in China. So he could be a voice of caution for pushing against the most extreme policies. But again, I think we need to be realistic. In Washington, among both parties, hatred of China and just scapegoating China for everything is unfortunately very bipartisan. And if you look at all of the people who have been named as likely candidates for Trump's cabinet, it's very hard to be optimistic.
Okay, so a lot of people were optimistic about Trump being anti-war, but a lot of people also brought up the fact that he's very pro-trade war. Do you consider trade war, obviously it's not as serious as a hot war, but do you think it's also quite serious?
Almost a certainty. And in fact, Trump has already announced that he has reappointed his trade representative. So that's the official who oversees U.S. trade relations. And previously, it was this man, Robert Lighthizer, who has been brought back. So he's once again going to be the U.S. trade representative. Who is Lighthizer? He is another anti-China hawk, and he's known for being a kind of populist Republican. He's an open protectionist. He wrote a book that says no. The book title is "No Trade is Free," but then you look at the subtitle, something about China attacking U.S. workers. So the entire narrative about his protectionism and his call for tariffs and trade war is that we have to fight China because supposedly China took all our jobs. I mean, that's the entire narrative. This is also what J.D. Vance has said. So there's all this momentum. There are all these people pushing in one direction, which is for worse relations with China. And Lighthizer is the figure as U.S. trade representative who was the architect of the trade war in China during Trump's first term. And where does Lighthizer come from? Well, he got his political career started working in the Ronald Reagan administration in the 80s, and he oversaw the trade war on Japan. And, a lot of people have compared the U.S. trade war on Japan in the 80s to the U.S. trade war on China today. There are a lot of similarities. Japan was a rising economic power. It was the main technological power in the world. And China is in a similar position. In fact, in 1987, Ronald Reagan, who's, very similar to someone like Trump, this, right-wing populist, Ronald Reagan put 100% tariffs on Japanese technology, electronic products. So I think there are a lot of parallels, and we can see what happened then, and I'd expect something similar to happen today. Of course, to be fair, I should say it's not just the Republicans. As I mentioned, Biden also put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, semiconductors, and batteries. So like I said, I think this is going to be bipartisan. But, there's no indication that the trade war will stop. All of the evidence suggests it will continue.
And hopefully China doesn't fall over to the US like Japan did. I have one more question for you today, Ben. This might be quite a difficult one, but I wanted to know what kind of advice you would give to Trump while he's setting up his new cabinet, if you had his attention for a few minutes. And I know there's a lot of issues that you care about around the world, but for this one, just when it comes to China.
Yeah, well, of course, stop supporting Israel. But yeah, to focus on China, I think there's a lot that could be said. First of all, the U.S. and China could have a lot of complementary trade. The idea that China must be the enemy of the U.S. is absurd. And also the idea of just putting blanket tariffs on all Chinese exports is ridiculous. It's actually going to lead to higher inflation in the U.S., increasing costs of consumer goods. It's going to be U.S. consumers who pay for those tariffs. Trump says that he's going to force other countries to pay for tariffs. That's not how tariffs work. U.S. importers pay for tariffs, not Chinese companies. So it's going to be U.S. consumers at the end of the day who pay for tariffs in the form of higher prices. Trump says he wants to help working people. Well, putting tariffs is not a way to help working people. Now, Trump says he wants to reindustrialize the U.S. I think that's a great idea. I hope we do reindustrialize the U.S. But then Trump also says that he wants to put 100% tariffs on countries that de-dollarize. So I would say, Trump, keep in mind, you have two contradictory policies. You have to pick one. Do you want to reindustrialize the country, or do you want to maintain the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency? If you go along with the trend toward multipolarity and you accept the US is no longer the dominant economic and political power in the world. It's part of a multipolar world. If you accept that other countries are seeking alternatives to the US dollar and you allow them to do that and you don't threaten them, this could also help to reindustrialize the US. Because one of the reasons that the US cannot reindustrialize is because everything is so expensive in the US. The dollar is overvalued. The cost of living is so high. If you actually devalue the US dollar, which would be another way of moving away from the dollar as the global reserve currency, of course, it would hurt Wall Street, and people on Wall Street would be fighting tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. But that would be good for workers of the US. It would be good for people around the world. So that would be bad for Wall Street, but who cares about Wall Street? That's what I would say, is that you have this idea that you want to reindustrialize, but then you also are surrounded by all of these people from Wall Street, including JD Vance, who got to start working in private equity and venture capital. You're funded by billionaires on Wall Street like Blackstone CEO Steven Schwarzman. You cannot be in that alliance with them and say you want to reindustrialize. China could actually be a partner to help reindustrialize. We've seen some examples of this. Famously, China helped open up a factory in Ohio. There's a documentary about this. I think it's just called The Factory.
Was that the one Obama produced?
Yeah, ironically, Obama produced it. But anyway, the point is that, this idea that trade is one side wins, the other side loses, winner takes all. That's not how trade works. By definition, trade is supposed to be mutually beneficial. Both sides are supposed to benefit. And you could have an advantageous relationship based on what China calls mutually beneficial win-win cooperation. I think that is possible. And I hope there are some people who maybe think that around Trump who can tell him that. But unfortunately, like I said, it's very hard to be optimistic when you look at the fact that most of the people around him are very anti-China hawks. And they see trade in the way that Trump sees it, which is one side wins, the other side loses, which is not how it should be.
Now, I know I said that was the last question, but I want to ask, I'm really curious, do you think that there's any chance that the US ambassador in Beijing, Nicholas Burns, will be swapped out?
It's hard to know. I mean, honestly, Trump has said that he wants to just basically do a purge of the State Department and get rid of anyone he sees as disloyal. So given that, I think it's likely we'll see someone different, but we have no idea who it could be.
Awesome. Ben Norton, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
And on that note, you guys, that will be it for today. But as always, I would love to hear your thoughts. Will Trump's presidency see some positive changes in relation to Sino-US relations? Probably not, according to Ben Norton. Or is that just a pipe dream? Was Trump right to give the boot to Haley and Pompeo? And who would you love to see in Trump's new cabinet? Do let me know down below. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help the channel. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.